Hello, everyone, and welcome to something of a very interesting message I kind of wanted to spread. And I just want to emphasize before we begin, I want to very strongly emphasize that I've not actually written anything down in preparation for this. In fact, I only really got inspired for this idea about 10 seconds ago. So let's just sort of go with it, shall we? Now, the run up to the general election of 2024, it might even possibly be coming out even months later, but I think for the sake of trying to get a handle on the things I kind of want to say, let's just go with these because these are the sorts of things that people are going to have to be considering when election time comes around. And unlike what has happened in the last few years, the election will come about. It will happen. It means that actual British people will actually get the opportunity to vote, not a very small portion of the population then deciding to vote for one person for right-wing newspapers to get behind them, screw the pooch after 40 days, and then go with basically plan B. Because a lot of this comes about when Liz Truss was made Prime Minister, and I remember how the Daily Mail even published on their front page that Liz Truss has got their vote. Liz Truss has got their vote, and because we knew exactly how that all played out with Truss and Kimmy Badenoch basically screwing the pooch on the economy so badly that the Bank of England actually had to get involved and Liz Truss had to resign in disgrace. And then enters Rishi Sunak, aka Plan B, or rather the person that quite a lot of people were sort of on the side of saying that they did not want. And what's about to happen, ladies and gentlemen, is signs that throughout, well, in fact, actually, to be honest, that's really the last point I really want to mention the Conservatives at this point, for one reason. For anything you want to say about them, anything at all, feel free to leave in the comments down below, because one thing I am absolutely going to be adamant on in saying from this very moment is the fact that whatever you may think of the Conservatives, whatever you may think of Labour, whatever you may think of the Lib Dems, whatever you may think of the BNP, the Reform Party, the Communist parties, whatever you want to think or anything you want to say about any of them, feel free to express it in your own words. I want to keep things as general as possible. So, and only really talk about either both A, things that we know have actually happened, and B, things I want people to keep in mind about what might eventually happen. So, let's just start with this. Regardless of which side my bread is buttered, I mean, I will just straight up tell you guys right now is that ever since the very first thing I was ever legally allowed to vote for was the Brexit referendum. And I may upset quite a lot of people in saying this, but I voted to remain within the European Union. That's about as much as I'm willing to say about that. And, well, actually, let's talk a little bit about Brexit just before we go any further. I'm going to keep this very, very short, and this is something that's actually mostly going to be directed towards the people who have actually voted to leave the European Union. So we are now almost 8 whole years after we voted to leave. We didn't officially leave until the day of my 21st birthday, aka 31st of January of 2019. I'm pretty sure it might have been actually 2020 when we officially left. So 5 years, 4 years, whatever you want to say it is. Well, let's just say 4 years, just for the sake of it. So in the 4 years that we've been away or out of the Union, has anything that we've actually done from that point actually, in complete sincerity, actually made life in this country any better? That's the first point I want to make. Now, whether or not you want to say that that question is irrelevant and that laws and things would be out of control whether we were in the EU or not, that's entirely of your choice, because unfortunately we don't have any evidence to suggest to the contrary. And that's a problem that maybe history kind of has at the best of times, is that there's no alternative version of history in which we could say, yes, we would have been better if we were still in the EU, because, of course, that's a version of reality that simply does not exist and that I have no way of actually being able to prove. So make of that what you will, because again, I can't sit here and say that we would have been better if we stayed in, and then problems with crime or with the boats or with anything else related to the initial concerns of why we even had the referendum in the first place. There's nothing I could really say that would have made these things for or against, unfortunately. So make of that what you will. Now, the next thing I wanted to touch upon, ladies and gentlemen, is the idea of, well, when it comes to the election time, what exactly are you voting for? And before you may say, well, it's very, very simple. You either vote for your Labour candidate representing your area, or a Conservative, or a Lib Dem, or a Green Party, etc., etc. You could immediately say that that is all you're technically voting for. And you're technically right. That is who you're voting for. But rather, what exactly is it you want? Maybe that's the better way of putting it. What would you want to see? Or what would you want to see be brought about? For example, do you want to see an improvement to public services? Do you want to see an improvement to the NHS? Do you want to see a tougher stance on crime? Not necessarily a police state, but do you want to see be in a world in which response times were faster, the attitude towards the police was somewhat a little bit more tolerable? Yes, you can. I'm not saying every police officer is perfect, but with some of the things that police, the work, the amount of actual work that the police do to prevent crime and to keep the public safe is actually impalpable. Tarnished mostly because of a lot of stories about really bad eggs from Wayne Cousins, as well as this recent story about how 999 calls was simply ignored by the police when people could have been saved, or even during the fire of Grenfell about who technically was responsible. And that's the sort of these are the sorts of questions that I'm openly asking people to give me answers on. Is that if I vote for you, who's going to take responsibility? Who is going to take accountability of what needs to be changed in this country? What needs to be addressed in this country? What is the problem? What is the solution? And who on earth is going to put it into action? That is the sort of thing I'm openly admitting to, ladies and gentlemen, the sort of things that I want to see. I want to see integrity, accountability, responsibility, consideration, care, and respect. I want to see these things flourish. I want to see people openly encourage these things. I want people to understand that they are nothing to be ashamed of. I want people to understand that if we didn't do anything about them, then simply nothing will be done. I want people to understand that Abraham Lincoln was just one man. I want also people to understand that Nelson Mandela was only just one man. I want people to also understand that Martin Luther King Jr. was also just one man. Now, again, whether you want to say that this is not including, the rest of the Black Panthers, and everything else, that the point I'm trying to make is that it's got to come from somewhere, and somebody. All of these cases, including thousands of others, they had to have come forward one point or another and say, you know what, it's not right. It's got to be somebody's responsibility. And bear in mind, ladies and gentlemen, now, for example, Nelson Mandela was arrested on grounds of terrorism. But they do say often, ladies and gentlemen, that one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. And who knows, ladies and gentlemen, there may even come a point later on this year where people will be pointing fingers rapidly in the other direction, calling everybody else traitor for the name of their own freedom and democracy. For that's one thing we've got to we got to keep all of these things in contention and consideration. If these are things that you are openly interested in, it could also be entirely true that people are not voting for any of these things. People are just simply voting for the hope that minimum wage goes up or that their own standard of life will improve and it will be less costly. And these things are completely fair enough. Is it all right and just to look after yourself every now and often? But one thing I am just going to close this video on, ladies and gentlemen, is something that I learned when I was about 17 years old, when I was in church and when the general election was on, mostly between David Cameron and Ed Miliband, about how it's the idea that it's a Roman Catholic's duty to make sure that the world is a better place when they leave it rather than when they were entering it. That is the sort of thing that I think is one of the most standing things when it comes to the idea of politics, is that it's not to make my life better, it's to make the rest of the world better. I know, again, you may argue, and indeed I anticipate these sorts of arguments about my generation will put it right. But at the same time, is it not better to try at these sorts of things? Is it not better to try and make life just a little bit more worth living in? It sounds a small thing, but the thing I really, really would like to see, especially when there'll be other videos coming out, is that we should try and make the world a bit better for people like you and me. If we could start on something quite general, but also something relatively basic, then everything else should sort of just fall in line. But again, ladies and gentlemen, these are only really my ideas and probably things that will need to be explained further in later videos. So let's just see exactly what comes out of this. Thank you for listening.